Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome us all to our final webinar for the International Women's Day series. I'm so glad everyone can join us here. We're still expecting more people. My name is Bomo Anthony. I'm the community lead at Niger Startups. I'll be hosting this session this evening. And I look forward to it. I look forward to it. Um, as you know, Niger Startups is a business leader network, and we connect business leaders, startups, in Nigeria. We connect them. We give access to a lot of opportunities, ranging from work opportunities, capacity building, and networking, and so much more. So thank you again for joining us this evening. Our topic, what we'll be discussing, is public speaking for women. Public speaking for women. And our speaker is none other than Rolake Akinkugbe-Filani. So Rolake will be taking us through this webinar this evening. I look forward to it. So I want to encourage everyone to get their notepads ready because we'll be having a Q&A session at the end of it. So I'll quickly run through Rolake's bio very briefly and then hand over to her. Rolake is an award-winning and versatile C-level executive with a unique blend of experience in energy, infrastructure, and finance services sets her apart as one of Africa's leading female business voices on global media platforms. As a corporate change maker with hands-on operational experience of the African continent, she is currently GM and Group Head of Investor Relations and Corporate Development at Zenith Bank PLC, one of Nigeria's largest banks. Rolake is known for her superb and engaging analysis and can expertly distill complex businesses, finance, and economic topics to a wide variety of audiences. She's a highly sought after financial, business, and capital markets analyst on media platforms like CNBC, Bloomberg, BBC, and CNN. She currently anchors a critically acclaimed weekend business show, Business Week, on Pan-African news channel Arise News. Prior to her current corporate role, she was Chief Commercial Officer and Director of the Pan-African Infrastructure Developer Mixta Africa ARM Group across 5 African countries. She was also the Senior Advisor to IFU and sat on the Global Advisory Board of Canadian private equity firm StoneChair Capital. She was recognized as a top 275 global female influencer executives in 2020 in energy by the UK's Energy Council, and in 2015 won the Best Africa Energy Analyst Award from Energy Africa US. She was also recognized as a young economic leader in Africa under 40 and was listed in the most influential people of Africa descent, MyPad 100 under 40 in the 2018 business and entrepreneurship category. So, I've just tried to sum up, Rolake's illustrious career, and now I'll hand over to Rolake. So welcome once again. Welcome. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. You will need to stop sharing your screen. Okay, so I can share mine.
Okay.
I still see your screen up? Okay,
Done.
fantastic, fantastic. Okay, so I'm using two screens here today for super efficiency. Okay, there we go. Can everybody see this? Let me know once it's, can you all see it? And can you all see me? More importantly.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm really honored that the team at Niger Startups invited me to do this evening. I hope that at the end of it, you will at least go away with one or two things that you find really useful and interesting. And with all of these things, I would like to encourage you to make comments and ask questions as we go along, put in your questions as we go along, because things may come to mind before the end of the presentation that you may not remember if you don't note down. So let's get started. One of the things I really like to do is to establish what I call the philosophy of public speaking. I know it may seem a bit strange, but these are essentially first principles. And they're just a couple of sound bites. You know, sound bites are those things that are really catchy that you see online that grab your attention. And because I've been coaching individuals and groups in public speaking for a while, there's some of these things that have become the usual things that I say when I tell people about public speaking. But let's start with a quote by George Bernard Shaw. Some of you may have seen this before. And the quote says that the single biggest illusion or problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. And I want that quote to sort of sink in for a minute. Just think about it. And I'd like a contribution or two from the floor. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. So one of the things that I will count as success today after I'm done is hopefully that all my slides and my talk hasn't been an illusion and that you'll actually understand and grasp what I've said. And I think this is a really important principle because essentially what it says that communication is a two-way street. It's one thing for the speaker or the person who's talking to say the words and deliver it to the best of their ability, but it's a completely different thing for the person who's receiving that communication to really understand it and to be able to make sense of it. So please bear that in mind as we go through this. I really love this image. I don't know what you think about when you see this image, but it's always a starting point with me because when I get a lot of my students come for lessons, a lot of people tell me that when they were young, they loved to talk. And somewhere along the line, they just lost that energy, they lost that fire. And then I thought about it for a while and I went back to the basics and I realized that every single one of us, when we're born, the very first sign of life is that cry. We all shout, we all scream, it's unsolicited. It's a way of saying, look, I'm here. And that's the kind of energy any newborn starts life with. So we cry for milk, we cry for food, we cry for attention, we cry because we're sick or in pain. And as we go through our toddler years, crawling years, we start to become children into young adults. That spirit of courage and boldness is somewhat socialized out of most of us. And this is a really important context and foundation to set. Because when people ask me, is public speaking nurture or nature? I say it's a mix of both. We're all born with an innate sense of courage. We like to announce ourselves into the world. That's what we've all done as babies. As children, toddlers, we ask a ton of questions. I have a 5-year-old and I'm in that phase. I mean, that phase probably started when he was about 2.5 or 3, where it's constant questions, constant feedback, constant talking. And I have to catch myself as a parent every now and again from telling him things like, oh, keep quiet, don't talk too much. Because as a communications coach, I'm very aware of the impact of socialization and environment in people's ability to be brave or bold public speakers. So this is a very important principle. we were all giving a level playing field in life insofar as announcing ourselves is concerned. But we're somewhat socialized out of it. We start to operate through filters. We go through all sorts of experiences in our childhood, in our teenage life, in young adulthood, that then shape our attitude, our approach to public speaking. And I say this particularly for those who have a serious and, in some cases, paralyzing fear of public speaking. I'll talk about that a bit later. So here are some first things first that I wanted to establish as we look into today. Communication is, of course, a language. This presentation is non-exhaustive because you have to remember that public speaking is a domain of communication. And if you have a fear of public speaking, then there's probably a problem somewhere in your approach or understanding of communication that needs to be checked. So when people come to me for public speaking coaching, after doing the consultation, I often find that the problem is not actually one purely of public speaking. There's some other issues that are going on around their whole approach to communication that needs to be corrected. The third point is it's more nurture than nature. If it was purely nature, there would be absolutely no point in Niger startups doing this webinar. But we're all having this because we believe everybody has the ability to evolve. That's why we call it public speaking skills, right? So we need to adopt a growth mindset insofar as our ability to learn the art or skill of public speaking is concerned. I'm also not here to turn you into Oprah Winfrey or whoever else overnight. This is a journey. But one thing I've recognized in my journey, and it's something that I call the virtuous visibility cycle, which ties into some of the other points I've made, is that for every time I've embraced an opportunity to speak, even when I didn't feel 100% prepared, it's then created the positive pressure that leads me to do the work of building my competence so that when I then stand on stage or stand in a boardroom or give a presentation, I'm ready and I can deliver an excellent performance or reasonably excellent performance. What that then does is it reinforces my confidence. And if I deliver well, I'm then invited to do it again. And because I'm invited to do it again, I then have to raise the bar from the last time I do it. So I go in, put in the more work, do it well, do my research, bring on my best game, and I deliver. And what that ends up doing is that it creates what I call a virtuous visibility cycle. So don't see public speaking as this end. It's an end that leads to other things. It is also positioning you to get recognition, gives you a platform to share your ideas and get recognition for your work. And the truth is, whether we like it or not, and some of you may dispute this, but people who are great public speakers or believed to be great public speakers generally tend to be perceived as better leaders. I know that's a very controversial statement, but based on my experience, on my observation, on my learnings, I think this is by and large true. Now, obviously, perception is different from reality, but the fact is, if you can communicate well verbally, like I said, communication is multifaceted, it's not just verbal. But if you can communicate well as an orator, you are generally perceived to be leadership material, even though it may not actually be the case that you're a good leader, right? The other point I would like to establish as one of my main opening sound bites is public speaking is like an art, right? It's not science. There's a part of it that is science, which is how you learn to be a public speaker. But in the moment of public speaking, I always say memorize the message, not your words. Now, for those who have a great deal of anxiety, who have analysis paralysis, tend to overanalyze, overprepare, overthink, and I'm that kind of type of person, I say to you is keep it simple, stupid. Simplicity is the name of the game. If you have a speech to deliver, and you can ask those who do TED Talks, they practice this in front of the mirror, but what they're memorizing is their ideas and their concepts and not your words. Now, if you try to memorize your words, you're already going to fall flat. I'm also a big believer in the art of using stories. That is why I say a picture paints 1,000 words. Are there more simple and more straightforward ways you can communicate your message without needing to be verbose, right? As we say here, local parlance. And speaking of local parlance, one of the things I discovered when I moved back to Nigeria is just how tedious the use of English in the Nigerian context is. You only need to flip through the pages of your average daily newspaper here to see what I mean. That's why I've always been a firm believer in the fact that a few words delivered powerfully is better than a torrent of information. And I teach a whole course that's called Clarity, Succinctness, and Follow Through in Public Speaking. I don't have time to go into all of that today, but it's something I will go into a bit more. And then just to complete my first things first sound bites. If your words, excuse me, that's a typo. It should be if your words and your body language don't sync, people will always read the nonverbal communication first, which is why any lesson or seminar on public speaking that doesn't talk about body language is completely incomplete. And the reason is this: long before man started to use language to communicate or verbal pronunciations to communicate, prehistoric man, Neanderthal, or whatever they're called, Homo sapiens from way back, actually communicated using images, using symbols, using inscriptions. It wasn't verbal for a long time for those who believe in that domain of science, right? What that says to me is that every human being has an ability to read nonverbal signals. So when you meet someone and they're talking to you or they're telling you a story, there's a subconscious part of your brain that's reading what they're not saying. And this is a very important principle for a public speaker, an aspiring public speaker. You then start to realize that what you say or what you don't say is just as important as what you do say. So there needs to be a level of intentionality around your body language. Then the next one is really around the art of goals and objective setting as far as public speaking is concerned. If you don't know what your entire objective is, your audience never will. And also, on this issue of two-way communication, always remember that your audience is speaking too. They may not verbalize it. When I do the section on reading the room, and I mean reading the room in a very literal sense, things like people nodding off, staring down on their phones, yawning, having side chats, sinking into their seats. That's the audience who are telling you, girl, you've been speaking too long, you need to shift gears or you need to do something different. And finally, you can speak well if the tongue can deliver the message of your heart, which is why I like to start every session very early on with this whole idea of authentic public speaking, authentic communication. And this is a bonus one that I like, which is not my own soundbite, which I saw somewhere, which I really love. It says, well-timed silence hath more eloquence than speech. I'm sure you see the humor in that. Sometimes the power of silence is such a great thing to use when you're speaking. And I talk about things like this when I look at vocal variety, or I look at the impact of pausing or rhythm in public speaking. Now, we're not going to have all the time to explore all these technical principles in depth on this, but I hope those sound bites kind of excite you and ginger you up for what is to come. Okay, so why should we even want to take the stage? I think I talked about this before. The reality is, let's be honest with ourselves, society can be superficial, right? Taking the stage is a big deal, which is why I tell everybody, if somebody invites you to speak and you have a reasonable understanding of what you're meant to say, and there is no conflict with your personal or professional life, please say yes and figure it out later. There is something about taking the stage and putting yourself out there. You will be critiqued, but it is a confidence reinforcer. It does something to your psyche. You start to see yourself operating at levels that you probably never imagined. And I tell this to people who are even early on in their career as public speakers. And always remember that there's the delivery and performance on stage, but there's what happens before and after. And like I said, when I was referring to the virtual visibility cycle, it forces you to do the work. Okay, I'm going to skip this one because I already talked about it. So I want to start with authenticity because I think that this is a very, very important one. Authenticity is so important. Be true to yourself. Now, people talk about the fact that sometimes, this cliche about being true to yourself doesn't work in all contexts. But why is this important? Well, authenticity essentially is a trust builder. Many people, because we're all kind of wired to be able to read nonverbal signals or the things that are not said. There's something about bringing your full self to the stage or to the boardroom or to the meeting room, whatever that domain of public speaking is, that puts you in a much better position to create a connection, a human connection with your audience. And this is something Aristotle, the great philosopher, talks about, which I'll talk about in the coming slides. Authentic communication is like a bridge builder. And one of the really easiest tools, techniques to use to communicate authentically is telling stories. I always say that if you go to hear a talk and it's very technical or whatever, and you go away and you want to relay what you heard to a friend or family member or whoever, one of the things you're more likely to remember than anything else is the person who told a story. And you're more likely to remember details of that story than to remember the technicalities of the presentation. And this is because there is something inbuilt, I don't know, it's just the psyche of humanity. We all connect to this concept of truth, even though truth is in short doses in our society. We essentially live in a post-truth world. But there's something about every innate human being that connects to something that they feel is authentic or is about truth-telling. And it essentially means that for every time you're communicating, in as much as is within your power to do so, your outer expression should match your inner reality. This doesn't always apply in all cases, but it should even come across in the tone of your voice. It's like someone saying that, oh my God, I'm so happy I received an A star on my test today. The tone of my voice belies the words I'm speaking. But the whole idea of authentic communication is that the words you're delivering match the reality of what you feel or what your convictions on a particular subject may be. So let's look at this. And I spend a bit of time doing this because I don't want us to get so bogged down with the techniques of public speaking, but with the essence, what I call the essence of public speaking. And I say this to women a lot because women, more so than I was going to say any other gender, but that's probably not politically correct because I was going to say, well, there are only two genders, but I may get into trouble for saying that. But let's just say women more than men, right? Sometimes are afraid to bring their full selves to their stage or their boardroom or to the table. Why? Because we often get told things like, oh, we're too emotional, we're too aggressive, we're too this. But you have to realize that the full domain of your entire life, whatever that mix is, whether you're a performer, you're a teacher, you're an academic, you're a business person, you're an investment banker, you're a pianist, whatever it is that you embody, never be afraid to bring the totality of your full self to the stage. And trust me, this works a trick time and time again. Because most often, many of us in the professional context are usually communicating to people in a similar professional context. So essentially, we're always performing and delivering like for like. But you often find that the audience is often interested in a human connection. So when you can relate at a human level, when they see you as more of a human being rather than a communications coach, then somehow you're more relatable. And the reason I put these three P's here is that I would really like everybody to really understand who you are in the context of your professional life, your personal life, your passions, and your pursuits. Most times when we're publicly speaking, we end up leaving parts of these domains outside of that stage of boardroom. But we actually don't realize that many of the things we engage in within our various domains, whether it's public, personal, our passions, our pursuits, are the things that could potentially make us really great public speakers. So my charge to you ladies is please explore the full gamut of who you are. The next time you're delivering a presentation on how to create a succession plan, because you're known as a wealth manager or whatever it is, what about the other areas of your life that may help you enhance your delivery on stage? What about telling a story from your family life that illustrates something about being able to plan a succession? Or what about telling a story about engaging one of your passions and pursuits that will enhance your ability to explain a data point as an economist? And I'm sure you get the picture. I'm not going to labor this too much, but it's really about bringing your full self to the stage. And the next part of it. So one of my favorite principles to explore, which I learned. So I studied politics and economics in university. And in my first couple of years, I took classes in political philosophy. And this is, these were the elements and principles that really set me off on this course. So Aristotle, great Greek philosopher, basically wrote a great book called Rhetoric, or the Art of Rhetoric. And I would encourage everybody who's really interested in public speaking to get this book. He talks about so many principles, but I've drawn out three of them, which I think are really interesting. He talks about ethos, and he says that great orators have to have ethos. I'm sure we've seen ethos, it's a root word for words like ethics and whatever. But in the context of which Aristotle uses it, it essentially refers to your credibility, why people should believe you, why you should listen, why they should listen to you. And there are two aspects that really make up, well, there's several aspects, but there are two main ones I wanted to focus on, is really around your credibility, which you derive from your expertise. So because you're a financial advisor, whatever it is, you're a doctor. So part of your ethos is your professional ethos, which is around expertise. That's what Aristotle defines in one sense as your ethos. But the other part of your ethos is what he calls your integrity and your character. This is a lot harder to measure, of course, because as a public speaker on stage, the people in the audience may not have the benefit of that experience with you. So they may not know you. They may know you as a professor or as a doctor or whatever, as an advisor, but they don't know your character. But he says this is equally important because there will always be people in society who listen to you, who have had some experience of who you truly are. And your ability to narrow the gap between who you truly are and your delivery on stage can impact your credibility. So it's like let me give you a simple example. Somebody who is known to have a really hot temper, a short fuse, comes on stage to give a talk about the power of patience. I'm sure you get what I mean, right? There's an integrity gap there because what people may know of them doesn't sync with what they're saying. Some would argue, well, maybe the person has learned through the experience of always having a short fuse and getting angry, so they're in a much better position to talk about the power of patience. But I think you get the general point. Ethos, credibility, your expertise. And where you cannot establish integrity or character because the people you're speaking to have no knowledge of you, it's important to establish your credibility by way of your qualifications, your experience, the casework you've done. But he then moves on and says, you know what, ethos is not enough. You need logos. And the best way to, well, logos is a root word for logic. It essentially, what Aristotle is saying is that you actually, at the very least, you have to make sense. You know how we are in Nigeria? Sometimes we're listening to someone and they say something that really hits the road and we're like, man, that girl really made sense. That is essentially what Aristotle is saying. He's saying that you may have all the credibility in the world, but do you actually make sense? Is it rational? Can people see the logic of what you're saying? So if you come on stage and you tell me 2 + 2 = 5, and me, as a member of the audience, I've always known that 2 + 2 = 4, because that's what we're taught in mathematics. It's a basic fixed law of maths. You have to tell me how you arrived at that point. And so what Aristotle is saying is that at the very least, show the audience, tell us how you arrived there. That's his concept of logos. But then finally, he wraps this up by saying, you may have all the credibility in the world and you may make absolute sense, but if you don't connect emotionally with the audience, you will fall flat. So that completes the triangle there, pathos. And of course, we hear pathos in words like apathy, empathy, sympathy. It's really around emotional connection. Why should people believe that what you have to say is important? Right? And I personally think that public speaking is not just about the art of the content of the delivery or the showcasing of expertise. It's essentially the battle for hearts and minds. And an illustration is, think about how you get all these charity emails. I just need to know that people are still with me and I've not lost them. Just so if the organizers can give me a rain check in the chat box, that would be great. But think about charities that ask for donations or money. And I remember when I used to receive all these emails, great, we're here, we're following, good stuff, Toyin and Aramide. And they send you an email and they show a picture of a child with flies on their face in Africa, whatever. Or they show an image that's really distressing, war, strife, whatever it is, famine. And what they do essentially is that they don't leave you there with your emotions. Guess what they do? There's also that flashing button that says donate now, there and then. And they've made it so easy for you because as soon as you click that donate button, it takes you to a link, you enter your credit card details, bam, 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 bam. So the point I'm making is that the pathos in public speaking is it's your call to action. So I've listened to you, you sound great, you sound good, you're making sense, you've connected with my heart, my emotions. In fact, you haven't connected with my heart and emotions. How are you going to get me to buy into what you're saying? It's really pathos. And that buying into what you're saying, it may not be a donation. It's maybe you want me to support a cause, you want me to take certain actions, or you want me to think in a certain way. Pathos is often what moves the audience from the point of understanding what you're saying, seeing the logic in it, and then moves them to actually take action or do something about it. That's essentially what Aristotle is saying. So operate through that filter when you think of yourself as a public speaker. There's so much more to it than knowledge and so much more to it than delivery. It's a connection and battle for hearts and minds. I hope you're still with me. If you want to learn more about Aristotle's techniques, read The Art of Rhetoric. I don't have time to go into all those philosophical concepts, but yeah, there you go. So you have a public speaking engagement coming up. Somebody has asked you to come and give a keynote. They've asked you to come and talk, or it could be your directors or exco at work or your board, and they've asked you to deliver a presentation on an area of expertise or whatever it may be. It may not even be an area of expertise. I know, by the way, just a quick bonus aside, this was in my presentation, but I just remembered. Some of you may have heard about my PI principle, about how you decide what engagements to accept and what speaking engagements not to accept. So this PI principle has worked for me. It's passion, interest, expertise. So I use those as filters. Somebody says, Rolake, can you come and speak today about the scourge of kidnapping in Nigeria? And I'm thinking to myself, I'm not a kidnap advisory expert. I'm not a negotiator. Why are they asking me? My filter is my PI. Am I passionate enough about this issue to be forced to do the amount of work required to speak competently about the subject on the day? So that's a passion, right? Passion filter. And the great thing about passion is like a propeller. So, for instance, it's also, if you see maybe those who have been sexually molested as victims, they didn't go to study laws around child abuse, sexual abuse, but because they've gone through the experience, they're passionate enough about it to be willing to do the work required to appear as an expert. Then there's your interest filter. The idea is, I have a reasonable interest in this subject matter. I think I can make sense of it. The stakes are not really huge here in terms of who the audience will be, so I can get by. And then the E part of expertise is that I know enough about the subject matter. I may find it boring to deliver because I've done it a million times, but I know enough about it to make sense. Now, those are my own filters. The degree to which you apply those filters when somebody asks you to speak about a subject area is totally subjective. It's up to you. You know yourself, but I use that because it helps me decide, this one I can accept, I can let go. The stakes are not so high. It's not a big deal. If I'm not an expert, I'm passionate enough about it. Obviously, if any one of us here who is not a doctor and somebody comes to ask us to speak about, I don't know, dissecting or not puncturing a lung when you're doing open heart surgery or something, I assume that on any of those filters, you will totally say no, right? Because it's just clearly not your learned area of expertise. So, I mean, those are extreme scenarios, but I just thought it would illustrate the point. So we're getting started with our next big speaking engagement. Ask yourself these 3 big questions. Who is your audience? Very simple. And I love what Nelson Mandela says. He says, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, it goes to his head. But if you talk to him in his own language, it goes to his heart. And language here, we don't literally mean literal language, although there's a place for that when we talk about cross-cultural communication, but that's a totally different lesson. But it's essentially like, understand who your audience is. KYA, know your audience. The same way you know your customer, KYC. Who are they? What do they know about the subject? Are they experts? What age or demography are they in? What are their motivations for coming into this talk? Are they experts like myself? Now, if they're experts like myself, it may help me pitch my delivery in a way that's not patronizing or condescending. If they're newbies on this subject matter, it may also help me pitch my delivery in a way that I don't end up speaking over the top of their heads. Honestly, knowing your audience can save you a whole lot of wahala, because you essentially, at least, at the very least, you can be assured that you will be able to connect with them. And it's everything from knowing their industry. If you work in a very technical industry and all you're saying is, oh, the DOB of the CAC in the GIZ is not going to help us reach PAT. And everybody in the audience is like, what the heck are you saying? These are very simple, basic things, but they won't understand the industry jargon. For those of you who watch my program Business Week, and if you don't, please watch it 10 a.m. every Saturday. One of the things I have to do often as an interviewer, I'm always interviewing technical experts. And they come on the program and they say things like CR. And I go, you mean cash reserve requirements? Not because I personally, as an interviewer, don't know, but because I want to ensure that my audience are not lost. We don't lose the audience. So I have to come back in and clarify and help the speaker realize that, please, don't just come here and be throwing abbreviations everywhere, because I have to assume on a TV platform, the audience is diverse and it's multi-generational, and not everybody will be a banker or an economist. So know your audience. And actually, I have a really other good example of knowing your audience. It's also about the human connection. Because if you find out a bit about your audience preferences, you can play to that and use that as a tool, as icebreakers or connections. If you have commonalities in your personal life, which may not be related to the professional life, then you can actually engage with them. What is your goal? What do you want people to do after listening to you? Is there an ask? Do you have a specific ask? Sometimes in public speaking, you need to state that ask upfront. Don't wait to the end. And some of the really great speeches and TED Talks, you'll see they do this. They tell you the goal, or they even give you the climax at the beginning, and then they work their way down there. And then this one I really love. What are the audience's barriers to action? So for instance, you've been asked to go and collect money from investors. You want them to invest $10 million in your startup, Niger Startups Incorporated. And you know that every time this audience member sees a Black woman on stage, they don't even give 1 penny. Here you are, the obtained Black woman who's about to go on stage to ask for 10 million yet again. And you know that these people have turned down every single Black woman. So you know that they have a barrier already in their mind. That barrier, I don't know what it is. It could be a gender barrier, it could be a race barrier. This is just a hypothetical example. So you have to ask yourself, for this giving audience, what are their typical barriers to action? Find a way to tackle and address those barriers to action upfront, and let that be your starting point. Understand what is holding them back, right? So it could be something as simple as, this audience is racist, is sexist, is whatever, even though it's hard to change those types of prejudices or stereotypes overnight. But you can essentially go in and say, assuming that this is the reality, that companies that are found, and start with a bold statement, that companies that are found to have diverse teams from a race or gender perspective perform at a higher ROE than companies that don't. Already you have linked their barriers to something that incentivizes them to change how they think about the issue or think about giving you money, whatever it is. That's not the greatest example I gave, but you get the presence. Or maybe you're trying to get people to sign up for a course, and all they've told you is that they had problems. You know that every time people try and get them to sign up for a course, they have problems downloading the application forms. Why not come to that talk with printed application forms? You've already removed one barrier to action. So you have to understand what your goal is and what you want to achieve. Yeah, and there's this question people often ask: what if the audience knows more about the subject than I do? I'd like you guys to get involved in answering this one. I'd like to see some comments in the chat box. What do you do if you find yourself in a situation where you believe or you perceive that the audience are experts and you're not, but you've been asked to give this talk? Some comments or suggestions? Anybody? This happens to everybody.
Yes, we have some comments.
Yeah.
request from Napa. She says, lean into your unique perspective.
Yay, go Napa, go Napa. Ask,
Aramide says, ask
in fact, you guys are
questions.
already taking my, you see, in fact, you audience, yeah, the exact type of audience I'm speaking about, because you guys are like taking my course here. Exactly. I mean, these are brilliant answers. Lean into your, and I always say that the reason you've been invited to give this talk is because you have a unique perspective to share. Absolutely 100%. No organizer or host, event host, wants their event to flop. If they thought there were people smarter than you or better positioned to do this thing, they would have invited them and not you. That's the starting point. Secondly, is what I said about knowing and understanding your audience. The only way you would even ask that question is if you knew who your audience was. Now, if you don't know who your audience is, you won't even be in a position to understand it. What if they know more than I do? Because you don't know who they are. So one way to get by that is to change, shift gears. And I talk about shifting gears in other courses. I don't have time to really go into detail here. Is give the work back to the audience, make them feel like they're the ones delivering the message, right? And this takes a lot of intelligence around how you organize your material and how you engage with them. It's as simple as them asking rhetorical questions or asking somebody to share an experience. It's as simple as AE, audience engagement, getting them involved. And I call it audience discovery, something I talk about. It's another way to structure your talk, where you can actually decide at what point in your talk or in the process of speaking publicly do you invite the audience. It actually reinforces your credibility. They then see you as a peer, a contemporary who's not here to lord it over them. And it breaks down barriers, because what you often find with public speaking, because human beings can be very superficial. There's this person standing on stage, see her, she feels like she's more superior than the rest of us, distilling knowledge to us in grades. And we are to receive and drink at the well of the fountain of knowledge that she has. Nobody ever wants to come across that way, right? So it's really about understanding how to pitch your speech. I see somebody laughing, smiling. It's really understanding how to pitch your speech in a way that doesn't alienate people, that draws them to you. And we can look at this more in, if you have questions around how you deal with hostile audiences or people who just don't like you for whatever reason, we can talk a bit more about that. So that's great. Thanks for those comments. Thanks for those comments. Okay, on to the next bit here. Why you? This is similar to that. Okay, but there's a why you, or why am I the one who's been invited to do this? Please know yourself, embrace who you are, embrace your strengths, do the work. I'm not going to have time to, but also think about why you so passionate about this issue. And another question, or another way to think about it, is what is at stake for me and for the audience if I do not deliver this message? Just think about it. Think about somebody who's running for an election and they have their final campaign speech. And that speech could be the decider between them winning, getting over the hurdle line to win the majority, and not. If they don't deliver it in the way they're meant to deliver it, what is at stake? Potentially the future of the country. Who knows? So you have to ask yourself, what is at stake if I, Rolake, do not deliver this message to this audience, right? Now, for every talk you're doing, it may not be as grand as, oh, the destiny of the country will collapse. But for whatever it is that you're saying, you need to be clear about what is at stake for you and the audience, yeah? Okay, next slide. This one, I want to talk about it. Because after you've done all this, some people will still be fearful. Some people will still feel like they're not ready. Where does your anxiety, self-doubt, and lack of confidence come from? I talked about the first cry, and I talked about what happens to us as children evolving into society, peer pressure, where we start to shrink. We all want to be in the background. Just go through this checklist. 9 times out of 10, honestly, if you ask yourself the truth, there's at least one item on this checklist that is causing you fear or anxiety. Let's be honest. Now, for the other 1% of people that there's nothing you say on this checklist that will just scald their anxiety, it may be a case of therapy. And I mean that in all seriousness. It could be that you haven't prepared, and you have to be honest with yourself as how much have you prepared to deliver this talk? Second, do you know enough about the subject matter? This is notwithstanding my pie principle. But even if you use my pie principle, that pie is just a starting point. You still have to arrive at the point of knowledge at some point before you deliver, right? Thirdly, have you had negative experiences or feedback? Now, the negative experiences or feedback may be a life issue for you, but it may be an in the moment issue. And what do I mean by an in the moment issue? You may just be speaking after a really fantastic public speaker, right? That is, in your mind, it could be a negative experience. It's actually a positive experience for the audience because they've just really, they've just listened to somebody in their eyes who's absolutely fantastic. And you are next, you're shaking in your boots and you're like, oh my God, how do you follow that act? But the starting point and the journey to your redemption is when you can even acknowledge that that is the problem. Because if you don't even acknowledge where the problem is, then you can't even talk yourself out of that negativity, right? So think about negative experiences in the broad sense, or you've had feedback, or the last time you delivered this, they booed you or they threw paper at you from the audience. There's also the part of you shun the limelight. Ask yourself, why do you shun the limelight? What is it that you're really afraid of in terms of coming out? And you may be the type of person you need to play that song before you go on stage. I'm coming out. I guess, but you get the message. You may need to do affirmations, and I'll give you some other tricks and things I do. I'm the kind of person that before I speak publicly, especially if I'm doing a physical appearance on stage, I love to isolate myself. Now, that's not a great thing because there's a part for mixing with the audience and engaging with people. But I love to be that kind of person. I can't eat. I probably will struggle to sleep, particularly if it's a big occasion. I cannot do anything that is part of my normal routine before I have a big speaking engagement. There's some people who need routine and are the complete extreme where everything around them has to be as normal and routine and as habitual as possible in order for them to deliver. Some of us, we like to remove ourselves first before we deliver. Others, we like to immerse ourselves before we deliver. The question is figure out what typically works for you. And it's so funny because my husband always says that every time I'm going into a high tension situation and he calls my public speaking engagements high tension, it's like everybody in the house has to scatter. It's almost like just leave mommy alone. Give her a cup of tea, just let her be, because he knows that anything he says to me in that moment, I'm not going to retain it in my mind because all I'm doing is focus. So they understand the kind of environment I need in order to function well on stage. So it's really about knowing thyself, be self-aware. Control, you lack control over the situation. You're probably thinking, oh, what would they say? Will they boo me? What if I fall through the stage? What if I have a wardrobe disaster? And then the fear of your mind going blank. Now, these are fears, right? These are not actual in the moment realities. So, in terms of dealing with some of these things on stage, we can talk about them. But the fear of your mind going blank, what exactly is the worst that could happen? You could freeze. But guess what? One of the reasons you're taking a public speaking class is because you're going to learn ways in order to get out of a situation where your mind freezes. Frequency, perhaps you don't speak enough. This goes back to the point I made earlier about embracing opportunities to speak and figuring it out later. And then know-how related to frequency and knowledge, you don't do it enough. Anybody has any other reasons, perhaps wants to share another reasons why they may be fearful about public speaking? Any other thing, this may not be exhaustive. There may be other reasons why you're fearful, but again, these are some of my go-to scenarios. I'll pause there. Any questions, comments before I enter another very important domain of public speaking? And this is my penultimate one before we take questions. No? Okay, I'm going to move on. Delivery. Okay, we'll talk about delivery. Are you saying, Gray Fox, is that delivery from the perspective of delivery, your concerns around delivery may give you anxiety? Or is that an area you want me to look at? I'm not clear about the comment. Maybe you can elucidate. Okay, Bomo says, growing up not allowed to speak. That's a very common one, I know, especially for women. That kind of girls should be seen and not heard, talk like a lady, don't shout too much, keep your voice low. For those of us who have young kids, those are things that can really stay etched in their memories. And I'm very conscious as a mother now to be careful about how I speak to those children, especially because as a public speaking coach, I see some of the lasting effects it can have well into adulthood. So thanks for sharing that. So this is my second major domain today. I wanted to talk to you about presence. Presence is like that kind of intangible thing, that va-va-voom, that kind of makes somebody stand out and gives them this aura, this gravitas. And I want to explore it a bit. But just before I do, I see Gray Fox says, deliver it the way you wanted it by taking them on a journey with a particular tone. Yes, exactly. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. So what is presence? Anybody know? I'd like some comments in the chat box. What is presence? Okay, let me even be direct. Do you think I have presence? For those of you who know me. So let's even start to peel it back. I want us to get practical here. Do you think I have presence? And if you don't think so, say no. It's all right. Yes. So can we take that step further? Okay, Bomo says yes. Why do you think I have presence? What are some of the things that you think make presence? Intonation, volume, maybe your height. Okay, that's an interesting one because there's a physical part of it, pronunciation. Yes, you do. Oluwatoyin Araliko, your control. Okay, I love that. So you guys are getting it. Now, I would say that presence is like this intangible thing that is tangible. And the best way I can describe it is you recognize when you see it and you sense it when you don't. Think about it for a minute. Think about when we make statements, she just has that something, he just has that something. And part of the problem with society is that sometimes the idea of presence can be developed into this thing that some people just have, and there's nothing you can do about it. False. I don't believe that to be the case. So when I think about presence, I think about the things that people have described as presence, either from a corporate space, because I've been working in a corporate space for a while. And some people would define it as, oh, leadership material. This presence, you know, when they walk into the room, when they speak, everybody listens. Or people with good presence, they present themselves as calm, even killed, they're composed, they're well prepared, they're in control at all times, there are no issues, and all of that. Or the way they talk, there's just something about the tone of their voice. And what I did as part of developing my communication courses, I developed something called your Executive Presence Index. And I'd like everybody to do a quick exercise now. You don't have to tell me what your score is, right? No need to tell me what your score is here. But there are essentially 8 categories. This is not an exact science. This is very subjectively Rolake's way of approaching this issue based on observing people who I think have presence, if you can define it in a way. If you look at Harvard Business Review, they define it in any other way. But the reason I've taken this approach, right, I've made it more tangible is because you can then look at yourself and say, okay, in what ways can I build presence? Presence is an important part of public speaking, right? And remember that public speaking is not just about being on the big stage with 1,000 people. It's as much as being in a room and presenting to 6 people, 6 of your colleagues, or going to a small seminar or doing a virtual session. So the first part of it is confidence, there's vulnerability, there's clarity in communication, there's authenticity, there's self-awareness and EQ, there's magnetism and charisma, and I'll come back to that in a bit. There's eloquence in communication, because clarity and eloquence are not always the same thing. And there's your grooming and dress, which is important. Dress how you want to be addressed kind of thing. On the confidence thing, the big question is then, okay, how do I build confidence? Confidence is psychological. There's a part of it that is about do your work, know your onions, you'll be confident. But confidence is almost like a reinforcing cycle. I always say, in order to feel confident, act confident. Feel confident, act confident. Feel confident, act confident, or act confident and feel confident. It's as simple as you're scared to death about walking into that room. But you push through your fear, you walk into the room anyway, you shake people's hands firmly, you look into their eyes, you introduce yourself. But you're scared to death, right? What that does is it reinforces in your mind that you're actually confident. And if you repeat that sort of process each time you find yourself in that situation, eventually you will start to believe that you're confident and you start to live it out. Now, I know it's not as simple as that. There are other ingredients that go into building confidence, but it's something that we need to practice because it's important. It gives leadership vibes, vulnerability, show your humanity. Don't be afraid to show your humanity. And that is part of what even creates things like magnetism and charisma. You're able to draw people. The reality is people may be attracted to the superficial, they may be attracted to, yes, the way you talk or the fact that you wear fine clothes and everything. But if you really peel back the layers, what draws people is often that human connection. And the more vulnerable you're willing to be without necessarily being perceived as weak, the more you're able to build those types of relationships, I beg your pardon, that are like magnets. And then clarity in communication is so key. It's key. If you struggle with it, then build it as a skill. Go to seminars, read the books, do what you need to do. Authenticity is similar to vulnerability, self-awareness and EQ. Self-awareness is so key in public speaking. Do you know why? If you find yourself in a situation where you're in a room and you plan to deliver a speech that was meant to last an hour, and you realize that you've been talking like a drone, and all people are hearing is zzz. If you're not self-aware, you will continue like that and lead people to their public speaking death, right? Death by PowerPoint. Whereas if you're self-aware, you're not only able to read the emotional climate, you're able to read the room. You can then make adjustments. Now, if you're not able to make adjustments, you're not adaptable, you're not flexible. You're like a car crash waiting to happen. So self-awareness is key. And what you find that people who have presence, when they enter a room, they're able to adjust for every conversation and every person they're speaking to. They just naturally adjust because not only are they self-aware, they're emotionally intelligent. Now, emotional intelligence usually has to do with the other. So whilst you can be self-aware, you also need to be emotionally intelligent so that when you're then engaging with people, you make adjustments. And another way this great motivational speaker terms it, Tony Robbins, he calls it matching energy. That's something I try to do. It's not easy, especially when you're interviewing on TV and you have some guests that come and they bore you and you can't match energy on TV, otherwise you'll fall flat. But the point is, you need to understand how to adjust with people, go with their ebbs and flows. If somebody is flowing this way, how do you flow with them in that way? Those are the things, and I hope I'm not speaking too philosophically. I'm sure most of you get what I'm trying to say. Of course, there's your grooming and dress. So for each of these things, score yourself honestly on a scale of 5. You don't have to tell me what your scores and measure your EP index out of 40. I have a more detailed methodology that you can use for these things. And just look at the areas where you need to, maybe when you need to do a bit more practice. And one thing leads to another. If you're not confident, it'll be hard for you to be charismatic. Or if you're not authentic, it's hard for you to be confident because you're confidently somebody being somebody else, or you're confidently being fake. And it's not an act you can keep up forever. So your EP is always work in progress. Remember that. Because of time, I'm going to share these slides with you guys, but there's just some final concepts I want to communicate. And I think I wanted to focus on, okay, well, we can do a bit of stage presence, but I don't want to, I think I've said quite a lot already. I think what Niger startups can do is if we're going to do, we could have a more practical part 2 session where we actually do some exercises. Today was more about the knowledge dispensation, not having a lot of time to do practicals, which I would typically do if I was doing a masterclass. But there are just a few areas that I wanted to talk. Maybe I'll focus on owning and reading the room, and then we can sort of call it quits so that you can ask questions. The reason I really love this is, about sometime last week, I moderated a panel at a Dubai conference where it was an all-male panel at the International Women's Leadership Conference. And I was moderating a panel that had the former CBN Governor, Sanusi, and 3 other gentlemen from around the world. And one of the things about being in a room that has over 600 women in it is that women, you know, our energy, our passion, we just react as we hear it. We don't even filter. So for everything the panelists are saying, there's, ooh, you know, everybody's kind of going crazy, especially with an all-male panel. And there was this one particular comment that was said by this particular gentleman, which shall remain unnamed. And he said it. I mean, the first time he said it, everybody was like talking, blah, 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 blah. And I, of course, as moderator, I was like, ladies, please, one house. And that should, at that moment, have signaled to the panelists that perhaps he needed to understand why people were reacting that way. Unfortunately, I personally thought he did not read the room. In fact, it got so bad that he went further and then, in my view, reinforced what he was saying, which just, I later heard that some people actually wanted to walk out the room. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that for all your credibility and ethos, for all your logos as a public speaker, right? Yeah, the art of doubling down. that's a really good one, Nava. And this is the thing. Flexibility and agility is not just a concept for MB or business. It's actually for public speaking. Read the room. Don't ignore the signals. 600 women in a room cannot be totally wrong. Surely. There's a reason why that reaction. And there are always moments on stage for you to pause and reflect in the moment and then make necessary adjustments. And some of the most successful speakers are not the ones who dig their heels in or double down. They're actually the ones who listen to what's being said and what's not being said very loudly and are able to make adjustments without losing themselves. And owning and reading the room, let's even talk about reading the room first. There are two ways to think about this. The first one is read the room in the moment. So you hear people suddenly shout. They're just angry at something or whatever. But there's reading the emotional climate of the day, which some of us do not do well. I was going to use an example that's very recent, but I thought, you know, that's probably too controversial. Let me give an example. It's like somebody cracking jokes about kidnapping in a country where kidnapping happens on a daily basis. They're not reading the emotional climate. And the comedy and skit makers and people who do stand-up comedies can be particularly guilty of this, is understanding why, in the context of what is happening in your environment, a particular topic or angle on a particular topic may not be the most appropriate illustration to use, because people are very angry about that issue at this particular point in time, right? That's a very, very important point. So reading the room in the sense of the general climate around what you're saying and the climate in the actual room in that moment. So reading the room, no, let's go back to, yes. So reading the room is really about things like awareness, inclusion. I think it was something that Aramide and a few other people said at the beginning around getting the audience, shifting gears, learning to change your tone. And also something I forgot to mention, 80% perspiration, 20% inspiration. What do I mean? Always leave room for inspiration. It's a kind of thing to this whole double down thing. Don't be so inflexible that, I prepared a 20-page speech, I must deliver it. I've lost count of the number of times where I've had to discard everything I planned to do on stage because something happened, or I suddenly discovered that the audience is a bit different, or I just realized something happened 2 hours before in the news and has changed the way this would be received. So make room for inspiration. And this is something those in the religious context understand. You come prepared to give a sermon and you feel led in the spirit in a different direction. Now, it's a very fine balance to strike, but let your intuition lead you sometimes, but not in the absence of preparation, please, because that can also lead you down a very troubling path. And I think that would be the note on which I conclude this talk. I'm very conscious of time. I don't want to keep talking forever. It's practically been about an hour. I'm going to leave room for conversations and questions, and hopefully I've been able to distill some knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rolake. I mean, we could listen to you speak about this, you know, all evening, but we definitely learned a lot. I'll quickly, because of time as well, I'll quickly go through one or two questions. So in the chat from Teju Fola Alade, okay, she's asking, how do we separate present from body size. There's a perception that people who are described as having presence, especially in Nigeria, are those with a sort of bigger body size. Please address this. Is there a link between the two?
Honestly, that for me is, I, I wouldn't even correlate the two in any way. I'm not saying that people don't judge you, but the other point I forgot, which then brings me to this point about presence, is you have to understand your setting and context. And I'll give you an example of one, and this is not specific to body size, but it may help you understand my response. In different environments, people prioritize and value different attributes. So if, for instance, you work in a corporate environment that really esteems people who can communicate well, then you should focus building your presence around your ability to communicate, right? Because it's what will help you get ahead. That's a simple example now. You may also be in other corporate environments where how you dress every day, you have to look the part, is more important than what you say. Understand the context and make your adjustments accordingly without losing yourself. I think that's kind of the best way I can describe it. On the part of size, I think that is superficial. Now, I'm not going to say that audiences don't judge and filter, based on their own preconceived notions or standards. But if you can achieve the ethos, logos, and pathos part, you don't have to be a certain body size to connect with people, right? It may be that when you initially enter the room, people will, of course, automatically judge you, but they do that for every type of physical attributes you have. By the way, so I keep diverting, but I think it's important. There's a certain part of my body that I personally used to be very conscious of on stage. And it got to the point where it started to become a distraction for me. So what I decided to do is that the type of clothes I would then start to wear when I'm on stage will help me not even have to think about this issue at all. And I don't need to tell you what that is because it's very personal to me. But the point is, I had to ensure that I was removing as many barriers I could so that I wouldn't then have to be conscious of, oh, what if they're looking at me like this? What if they're, no, I ensured that within myself, I was fully comfortable in my dress and that I was able to just deal with that small insecurity I had around that particular area of my physical appearance. And so I guess the point is the problem, do you perceive the problem to be the audience or you? Are you projecting? So if body size is perceived to be an issue, is it because you feel conscious about it? Now, if it's something you can control or manage in some way, go ahead and by all means doing that because it's one less distraction. But if it's not something you can control or manage, then the question is, what can you do within the context of your delivery that will detract attention away from that thing and ensure that you're able to deliver your objectives? I hope that helps.
Thank you, Rolake. I'm sure Tejo will leave her comment, but yes, that was very clear. We have one more from Gray Fox, really quickly. I would like to ask, how was your early stage of speaking? So how did you find it in the beginning?
Okay, so this is such a true story. So my colleagues used to, in the UK, I had this problem. It was just crazy. They would hold up a piece of paper and just say, slow down. And it was literally a problem I had, but it was nerves. It was a lot of things. But I found that the more I spoke, the more I embraced opportunities, and I went through that whole virtuous visibility cycle I described. I became better. Sometimes I still speak quite fast, but I've also learned the art of life imitating form. If there's certain things I want to emphasize, and I now know how to control, I'm much more in control. But in the early days, I was just a train wreck. I was literally all over the place. I also used to over prepare. And even though I still do that sometimes now, as you can see, but I think the early stages, it was more about speed and pace of talking and just not learning the art of KISS. Keep it simple, stupid.
Okay, thank you very much. From Napa, she says, my first public speaking session, people fell asleep. It's the journey. Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, we need to infuse a bit of energy or shifting gears. I think with those sorts of things, one of the ways to shift gears is to suddenly ask everybody to stand up or turn to their neighbor or something. You find that, or even walk around, walk up to people and ask them a direct question. Or the one that we're also accustomed to, for those of us who went to like school in Nigeria, when there's a noisy room and you suddenly want everybody to get attention, you just go quiet on stage. There are all sorts of ways to shift gears. There are all sorts of ways to get people to do something different to what they're doing. The sleeping one, yeah, that's tough. Sorry about that. Hopefully, with this session, you'll find more ways to be creative about it.
Yes, I mean, I guess if it was a small group where it was so obvious you could, and the person was sleeping, that would have been tough. But if it's in a big crowd, then you just leave it, I guess.
Yeah.
From Gray Fox as well, he said, "How do you own your speech?" I think you touched on that, but if you'd like to still.
How do you own your speech? I think the authenticity part is important.
Okay.
And the power of conviction in what you're saying. Truly believe what you're saying. Don't be the person that just copies and pastes what somebody else has said. And the more personalization and stories you can weave to it, the better it is. And I think why that is true, because stories show that there's been real life experience. It's easy, it gives you credibility. And I think that really would help you own it. And ideally, we should be talking about the things we ourselves have ideally lived through, have practiced, or have seen as real in our lives, right? So it's easier to take ownership of something that's true and authentic than to take ownership of something that you can't even give validation to.
Thank you for that. So I'll just read the comments generally. People are saying thank you so much. A really insightful teaching today. This webinar was really, really insightful. We have great delivery from Temitayo. Loved it. Thank you. Amazing delivery. Thank you. So these are just some of the comments. I would just ask, I know you've already spoken a bit about it, but if you have any sort of final words for us to just remember. I know you gave us sound bites in the beginning, but something to just take away now would be great.
Yeah, for me, the one thing I would say is that if there's nothing you heard from this thing and somebody asks you to come and speak about a certain topic tomorrow, start with telling a story. It works a trick time and time again, and it's the one thing people always remember. Stories are very powerful.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll definitely remember that. I'll speak on behalf of everyone. And say that was a very good soundbite to leave it on. Rolake, we'll have to invite you again for a master class, for a practical session. We'd like to do a deep dive, definitely, into public speaking. This was very useful for me, and from the comments here, I can see so many people benefited from this. Public speaking to me is not just to a large group, it could be a small group, it could be different audiences, as you've explained. So I'll definitely be taking these tips, and I'm sure our participants here would be as well. So thank you once again. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good rest of the evening. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.